Please welcome to the South by Southwest stage, our opening keynote, Casey Gerald.
Thank you, Todd, and thank you all for pretending I'm Barack Obama for just a little while. You're very kind of you. So there we were, souls and bodies packed into a Texas church on the last night of our lives. Packed into a room just like this, but with the creaky wooden pews draped in worn-down red fabric, with an organ to my left and a choir at my back and a baptism pole built into the wall behind them. A room like this, nonetheless, with the same great feelings of suspense and the same deep hopes for salvation, and the same sweat in the palms, and the same people in the back not paying attention. This was December 31st, 1999, the night of the second coming of Christ and the end of the world as I knew it. I had turned 12 that year. I had reached the age of accountability. And once I stopped complaining about how unfair it was that Jesus would return as soon as I had to be accountable for all that I had done, I figured I had better get my house in order very quickly. So I went to church as often as I could. I listened for silence, as anxiously as one might listen for noise, trying to be sure that the Lord hadn't pulled the fast one on me and decided to come back early. And just in case he did, I built a backup plan by reading the Left Behind books that were all the rage at the time. And I found in their pages that if I was not taken in the rapture at midnight, I had another shot. All I had to do was avoid taking the mark of the beast, fight off demons, plagues, and the Antichrist himself. It would be hard, but I knew that I could do it. But planning time was over now. It was 11:50 p.m. We had 10 minutes left, and my pastor called us out of the pews and down to the altar because he wanted to be praying when midnight struck. So every faction of the congregation took its place. The choir stayed in the choir stand. The deacons and their wives, or the Baptist bourgeoisie, as I like to call them, took first position in front of the altar. You see, in America, even the second coming of Christ has a VIP section. And right behind the Baptist bourgeoisie were the elderly. These men and women whose young backs had been bent under hot suns in the cotton fields of East Texas, and whose skin seemed to be burnt a creaseless, noble brown, just like the clay of East Texas, and whose hopes and dreams for what life might become outside of East Texas had sometimes been bent and broken even further than their backs. Yes, these men and women were the stars of the show for me. They had waited their whole lives for this moment, just as their medieval predecessors had longed for the end of the world. And just as my grandmother waited for the Oprah Winfrey Show to come on Channel 8 every day at 4 o'clock. And as she made her way to the altar, I snuck right in behind her because I knew for sure that my grandmother was going to heaven. And I thought that if I held on to her hand during this prayer, I might go right on with her. So I held on, and I closed my eyes to listen, to wait. The prayers got louder, and the shouts of response to the call of the prayer went up higher even still. And the organ rolled on in to add to the dirge, and the heat came on to add to the sweat. And my hand gripped firmer so I wouldn't be the one left in the field, and my eyes clenched tighter so I wouldn't see the wheat being separated from the chaff. And then a voice rang out above us, "Amen." It was over. I looked at the clock. It was after midnight. I looked at the elder believers whose Savior had not come, who were too proud to show any signs of disappointment, who had believed too much and for too long to start doubting now. But I was upset on their behalf. You see, I had been duped, hoodwinked, bamboozled. We all had, and I had gone right along with them. I had prayed their prayers. I had yielded not to temptation as best I could. I had dipped my head not once, but twice in that snot-inducing baptism pool. I had believed. Now what? I got home just in time to turn on the television and watch Peter Jennings announce the new millennium as it rolled in around the world. And it struck me that it would have been strange anyway for Jesus to come back again and again based on the different time zones. And this made me feel even more ridiculous. Hurt, really. But there on that night, I did not stop believing. I just believed a new thing, that it was possible not to believe. It was possible the answers I had were wrong, that the questions themselves were wrong. And now, where there was once a mountain of certitude, there was running right down to its foundation a spring of doubt, a spring that promised rivers. I can trace the whole drama of my life, and perhaps in some way, the drama of my generation, back to that night in that church when my Savior did not come for me, when the thing I believed most certainly turned out to be, if not a lie, then not quite the truth. And even though most of you prepared for Y2K in a very different way, I'm convinced that you are here because some part of you has done the same thing I have done since the dawn of this new century. Since my mother left and my father stayed away and my Lord refused to come. And I held out my hand, reaching for something to believe in. I held on when I arrived at Yale at 18 with the faith that my journey from Oak Cliff, Texas was a chance to leave behind all the challenges I had known, the broken dreams and broken bodies I had seen. But when I found myself back home one winter break with my face planted in the floor, my hands tied behind my back, and a burglar's gun pressed to my head, I knew that even the best education couldn't save me. I held on, and I arrived at Lehman Brothers in the summer of 2008 as a summer intern. I don't think that's a line to clap. So hopeful that I called home to inform my family that we'd never be poor again. But as I witnessed this temple of finance come crashing down before my eyes, I knew that even the best job couldn't save me. I held on. When I arrived in Washington, D.C. as a young staffer who had heard a voice you'll hear much later call out from Illinois saying, it's been a long time coming, but in this election, at this defining moment, change has come to America. But as the Congress ground to a halt and the country ripped at the seams and hope and change began to feel like a cruel joke, I knew that even the political second coming could not save me. I had knelt faithfully at the altar of the American dream, praying to the gods of my time of success and money and power. But over and over again, midnight struck, and I opened my eyes to see that all these gods were dead. And from that graveyard, I began the search once more, not because I was brave, but because I knew that I would either believe or I would die. So I took a pilgrimage to yet another Mecca, to Harvard Business School. This time knowing that I could not simply accept the salvation that it claimed to offer. No, I knew there'd be more work to do. The work began in the dark corner of a crowded party on the late night of an early, miserable Cambridge winter, when three friends and I asked a question that young folks searching for something real have asked for a very long time. What if we took a road trip? We didn't know where we'd go or how we'd get there, but we knew we had to do it because all our lives we'd yearned, as Jack Kerouac wrote, to sneak out into the night and disappear somewhere and go find out what everybody was doing all over the country. So even though there were other voices who said that the risk was too great and the proof too thin, we went on anyhow. We went on 8,000 miles across America in the summer of 2013, through the cow pastures of Montana, through the desolation of Detroit, through the swamps of New Orleans, where we found and worked with men and women who were building small businesses that made purpose their bottom line. And having been trained at the West Point of capitalism, this struck us as a revolutionary idea. And this idea spread, growing into a nonprofit called MBAs across America, a movement that landed me here on this stage today. It spread because we found a deep hunger in our generation for purpose, for meaning. It spread because we found countless entrepreneurs in the nooks and crannies of America that were creating jobs and changing lives and who needed a little help. But if I'm being honest, it also spread because I fought to spread it. There was no length to which I would not go to preach this gospel, to get more people to believe that we could bind the wounds of a broken country one social business at a time. It was this journey of evangelism that led me to the rather different gospel that I've come to share with you today. It began one evening almost a year ago at the Museum of Natural History in New York City, at a gala for alumni of Harvard Business School. Under a full-size replica of a whale, I sat with the titans of our time as they celebrated their peers and their good deeds. There was pride in a room where net worth and assets under management surpassed $500 billion. We looked over all that we had made, and it was good. But it just so happened, 2 days later, I had to travel up the road to Harlem, where I found myself sitting in an urban farm that had once been a vacant lot, listening to a man named Tony tell me of the kids that showed up there every day. All of them lived below the poverty line. Some of them carried all of their belongings in a backpack to avoid losing them in a homeless shelter. Many of them came to Tony's program called Harlem Grown to get the only meal they had each day. Tony told me that he started Harlem Grown with money from his pension after 20 years as a cab driver. He told me that he didn't give himself a salary because despite success, the program still struggled for resources. He told me that he would take any help that he could get, and I was there as that help. But as I left Tony, I felt the sting and salt of tears welling up in my eyes. I felt the weight of revelation that I could sit in one room on one night where a few hundred people had $500 billion, and another room 2 days later, just 50 blocks up the road, where a man was going without a salary to get an 8-year-old girl her only meal of the day. And it wasn't the glaring inequality that made me want to cry. It wasn't the thought of hungry, homeless kids. It wasn't rage toward the 1% or pity toward the 99. No, I was disturbed because I had finally realized that I was the dialysis for a country that needed a kidney transplant. I realized that my story stood in for all those who were expected to pick themselves up by their bootstraps, even if they didn't have any boots. That my organization stood in for all the structural, systemic help that never went to Harlem or Appalachia or the lower Ninth Ward. That my voice stood in for all those voices that seemed too unlearned, too unwashed, too unaccommodated. And the shame of that. That shame washed over me like the shame of sitting in front of the television, watching Peter Jennings announce the new millennium again and again and again. I had been duped, hoodwinked, bamboozled. But this time, the false savior was me. You see, I've come a long way from that altar on the night I thought the world would end, from a world where people spoke in tongues and saw suffering as a necessary act of God and took a text to be infallible truth. Yes, I've come so far that I'm right back where I started. Because it simply is not true to say we live in an age of disbelief. No, we believe today just as much as any time that came before. Some of us may believe in the prophecy of Mark Andreessen or Peter Thiel. We may believe in the Bible of Fast Company or the Harvard Business Review. We may believe most deeply when we worship right here at the Church of South by Southwest, but we desperately want to believe. We need to believe. We speak in the tongues of charismatic leaders who promise to solve all our problems. We see suffering as a necessary act of the capitalism that is our God. We take the text of technological progress to be infallible truth, and we hardly realize the human price we pay when we fail to question one brick because we fear it might shake our whole foundation. But if you are disturbed by the unconscionable things that we have come to accept, then it must be questioning time. So I have not a gospel of disruption or innovation or a triple bottom line. I do not have a gospel of faith to share with you today, in fact. No, I have and I offer a gospel of doubt. The gospel of doubt does not ask that you stop believing. It asks that you believe a new thing, that it is possible not to believe. It is possible that the answers we have are wrong. It is possible the questions themselves are wrong. Yes, the gospel of doubt means it is possible that we, on this stage, in this room, are wrong. Because it raises the question, why? With all the power that we hold in our hands, why are people still suffering so bad? This doubt leads me to share that we are putting my organization, MBAs Across America, out of business. We have shared our staff and closed our doors, and we will share our model freely with anyone who sees their power to do this work without waiting for our permission. This doubt compels me to renounce the role of savior that some have put on me, because our time is too short and our odds are too long to wait for second comings, when the truth is that there will be no miracles here. And this doubt, it fuels me. It gives me hope that when our troubles overwhelm us, when the paths laid out for us seem to lead to our demise, when our healers bring no comfort to our wounds, it will not be our blind faith. No, it will be our humble doubt that shines a little light into the darkness of our lives and of our world, and lets us raise our voice to whisper, or to shout, or to say simply, very simply, there must be another way. Thank you.
Nice job. Sorry, Jim.
That's all right.
So the headline here is, Casey Gerald comes to South by Southwest to tell the world that he is killing the successful company he started. The company that got him on the cover of Fast Company, the company that got him invited to be the keynote speaker at South by Southwest. How did people respond when you decided you wanted to do this? I'm thinking of your partner in the company. I'm thinking of the benefactors who had donated money to make your vision come true, and the people you had helped over the course of 3 years.
That's a hell of a headline. To be honest with you, people were quite upset. I mean, I had folks on the staff who were very upset. We had fellows who stopped talking to me for a month, I had a donor just about a month or two ago sort of sit me in her, one of these Upper East Side, parlor kind of things, and berate me for about 2 hours, because her sense was that She gave her money to help build the next Teach for America, which is a totally fine organization. But the reality is that, we started this, and I think about my co-founders, Michael Baker, Hisham Malawi, Amaris Singer. Michael Baker is still with us. We started this not to build some huge organization. We started this because we had a very simple question. What if we used all this education we got, not just to make a buck, but to make a difference? And that question took us 8,000 miles across the country in 2013 on our own dime, in our own cars. Nobody believed in us, really. And what we found is extraordinary people out in the country who were, against great odds, trying to make some difference and trying to build something out of their lives and solve the challenges they saw. And so we weren't building a program, we were trying to scale answers to questions. And those two questions were, how do we help create a generation of business leaders that is a central force for progress? The second question is, how do you help create a country where everybody's got a shot? And at some point, it became abundantly clear to us, Michael Baker and I especially, when we were faced with the prospect of a $400,000 grant from a major foundation, which would have been the largest cash infusion ever, we saw that instead we ought to take all this success and open people's eyes to the real challenge that we face in terms of answering the questions that we very, very much care about.
I understand why you felt like it was time for you to leave MBAs across America, but it was a successful organization doing valuable work. Why couldn't it have continued without you?
I tell people all the time that we're putting the organization out of business and we're liberating the work. Mm-hmm. If the work of MBAs across America stops because the organization does not exist, then we built a bad organization, right? So when we talk about giving the model freely to people, our fellows, we say, you don't need to come ask for my permission to take a road trip. I mean, it's not like we created the Google algorithm, this is not rocket science. You get in a car, drive somewhere, try to help somebody, and they're spending, our fellows, MBAs at top business schools, they're spending $200,000 to get a degree that's supposed to make them good at business. So I'd say, if I put 4 Stanford MBAs in a cafe in Little Rock, Arkansas, for any period of time, and the business is not better when they leave, they should get a refund. I mean, this is, pretty straightforward. So what we see is that the organization is not the only way that we can do work that makes a difference in communities across the country. So we've got, right now, fellows at Yale who have organized 30 students to do it on their own. We've got fellows at University of Michigan who organized 25 students to do it on their own. We had a kid email us from Sweden saying, when is MBAs across America coming to Sweden? I said, I'm not coming to Sweden, but I'll give you everything I know, and now he's doing it himself. And what we see is that the challenges are too big to wait for some central authority to give you permission. And by the way, we knew that this should also be a part of the way business leaders are trained. So we launched a course at Harvard Business School last fall. That's a year-long course, taking this model and putting it into curriculum. So I say all that to say the organization going out of business is actually quite critical to convince people that the work is not organizational work, it's human work.
Got it. So the main theme of your speech was this gospel of doubt, the value of doubting things that you deeply believe in. And you talked about things in the past that you used to believe in and have come to doubt. But I'm curious, what about the things you currently believe in? Is there anything that you believe in right now that you've been wondering if maybe you're wrong about?
You make me sound like a nihilist, Jeff. I've given a version of this talk in the past month in 3 places. On the main stage at TED, where I met the great Haley Van Dyke here, who hopefully you all meet. At Harvard University last weekend, and here at South by Southwest. And I locked myself up when I was writing this thing, trying to figure out what I was talking about. I locked myself up in a house in Possum Kingdom, Texas. I don't know if anybody knows Possum Kingdom, where there are no possums. I mean, it was like, what is this? And the first day was all about trying to figure out who exactly am I talking to? I mean, what am I trying to do here before you write down any words? And I realized that I wasn't talking to the people take TED for example. I wasn't talking to the people in the room at TED necessarily. I wasn't talking to the people who would ever be invited to a place like TED. I was trying to talk to the people who would never be invited to a place like TED or a place like Harvard or a place like South by Southwest, and to tell them not to believe blindly the people in the room at TED and Harvard and South by Southwest, including myself. This is not an accusational exercise. This is deeply confessional for me. I think William F. Buckley used to always say, I'd rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the phone book than by the faculty of Harvard University, and I think there's something to that. In that, until the great masses of people realize that they're in some special jujitsu magic that the elites of our time have that's going to solve all our problems, we're going to be in real trouble. And so the gospel of doubt is not telling people to stop believing everything. The gospel of doubt is saying, make a little room to question the people who tell you they have all the answers, because they probably do not.
All right. Well, speaking of which, at the very end of your speech, you said, there must be another way, you said. It's a stirring closing, and it has the advantage of prompting people to come up with their own answers. But it's also a little general. It lets you off the hook a little bit. So I'll ask, based on your experiences and your reading and the thinking you've been doing, do you have any notions, however tentative, of what that other way might be?
Yes. And it's shaped by, there's a professor at Harvard Business School named Rebecca Henderson, who teaches a course called Reimagining Capitalism. And by the way, the very fact that a course called Reimagining Capitalism is being taught at Harvard Business School means we live in revolutionary times, you see. And the central question of this course is, how does business help solve the big problems facing society? And Professor Henderson, to answer this question, breaks all action into sort of a Venn diagram. Two circles in the Venn diagram. One represents all the things that make money, and the other represents all the things that do good. And at the intersection of the Venn diagram, she has what she calls a bucket one solution, which is a business case that we can do well and do good at the same time. Think of Walmart making its supply chain more sustainable, not just because it's good for the planet, but because it saves Walmart money. And this is great. We should write cases about this. We should get more people to understand these kinds of interventions. But the challenge with bucket one solutions is that it only gets us to about 15% of the way to the world that we want to see. So then she says we're pushed into something called a bucket two solution, which is an innovation solution, right? Innovation is, in her terms, basically asking leaders and organizations to take short-term risk for long-term gain, right? So this is Paul Pullman at Unilever, this is Elon Musk at Tesla, folks who will say, I'll take the risk, I'll take the lead because I'm betting on the future. Wonderful. We need these kinds of visionary leaders to do that. But the challenge is that even with bucket two solutions, we only get to about 60% of the way to the world that we want to see, that we have to see right now. So then the question became, well, how do you get the rest of the way? How do you get the rest of the 40%? And Professor Henderson studied the entire history of Western capitalist civilization and found that the only time we get to bucket three solutions, whether it was, ending child labor in Britain or ending slavery in the United States, is when there's been a social awakening. And this is not some leftist, this is an innovation economist, and so I asked the most natural follow-up question. I said, Professor Henderson, how exactly do you get a social awakening? And she said, what very few professors will say, which is, I don't know. So it strikes me that the better way, the other way, the only way perhaps, is to try to figure out how we can spark a social awakening in this country that shifts the consciousness of how we actually, is again, not complicated, how do we end unnecessary suffering in the richest civilization in the history of mankind? It strikes me that we've got a lot of people working on buckets one and two, we've got to get some awakening work done. And that's going to start partially with, I hope, this gospel of doubt that shows people we don't have time to wait for permission. We don't have time to wait for saviors and second comings. It's time to get to work, and it's time to question both the gods of our time and the gospels they preach.
We're in the middle of a very tumultuous political cycle right now. Do you see, in that tumult, do you see any signs that people are ripe for that sort of awakening?
Listen, I'm not a political expert. I don't know. What it strikes me is that having spent the past 3 years going, 50,000 miles across the country and, towns as small as 900 people in Montana, the towns in Appalachia, Detroit, is that people realize that they are up against extraordinary odds, structurally, spiritually, and people are not really convinced that anybody who's running the show at present is going to do anything about it. So it would strike me that whatever the answer is in this political season, whether any party goes with the more radical options or the more conservative options, that it would be a mistake to see this moment as a purely political moment. Mm-hmm. This is a moment where people are, and I don't say this in a fluffy way, people are hurting in very serious ways. People are experiencing deep psychological trauma as to the question of how they fit in the future of this country and the future of the world. And somebody's got to answer that. It can't just be a politician, but I think part of the vitriol from citizens is this deep hunger for somebody to listen and understand how they're feeling. But you know better than I do. I mean, you're the reporter. I don't know.
So with the closing of MBAs across America, you're shifting into this mode where your career is mostly about giving talks, writing books. I know you're putting together a book proposal right now. And both of those are wonderful things to do and can spur any number of people into action. But you first made your name by directly engaging the world, by driving across the country, meeting with people, making a real difference in people's lives. Do you think at any point you'll feel compelled to shift once again and get closer to the direct task of making a difference?
I asked Jeff backstage,
Go ahead.
I asked Jeff backstage, I said, Jeff, if you were in hard-hitting, ruthless journalist mode, what's the question you would ask me? And he basically said, I'm just going to paraphrase, Casey, you've been doing real work. Now you're turning into somebody that's, full of BS. Why is that?
He asked.
I mean, that strikes so much truth in that. That's so great. Here's the reality as I see it. Driving around the country, talking to people, saying you're making a direct difference in the lives of people does not necessarily mean you're making a difference in the lives of people. There are a lot of folks who are doing direct work, myself included, who could totally pull the wool over your eyes and not make any demonstrable difference whatsoever. And I also know that we have, it's funny, I was talking to somebody who runs a big speakers agency a few weeks ago, and he said the vast majority of speakers, 98% was his number, are committing intellectual fraud every time they step on stage. Sure, I am totally aware of the great temptation to be a fraud. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a very lucrative business. But the reality is that whether I'm giving a speech or writing a book or building an organization, trying to deliver services, help with people, it all comes down to the same thing, and it's sort of grounded in the values of MBAs across America. 4, 1, give a damn. One of our entrepreneurs said there's no line item on a balance sheet for give a damn, but it's the most valuable thing you've got in the business. Either you care or you don't, and that's the foundational thing. The second is to listen more than you speak, was our second value. And obviously if you're speaking, if you're giving a talk, you're speaking a lot, but it only works if you're listening to people. Mm-hmm. if you're listening to the things that obviously a very silent audience is saying or feeling, right? It doesn't work if you're just talking at people. The third is to act more than you plan, right? A 100-page PowerPoint deck is never going to save anybody's life, right? And the fourth, and I think most important, is to embrace discomfort and uncertainty. Proximity, feeling at the surface of your soul, the raw connection to humans, is something that whether you're giving a speech or writing a book or trying to build an organization that makes a difference in the lives of people, I mean, the balance, the question, the rubric is all the same. Books have saved my life. Speeches, I was just listening to a speech this morning to try to get in the zone. So I think we really ought to be careful not to confuse mediums that might be tainted with their transformative power.
Who were you listening to this morning?
I was listening to two speeches. One was a speech that Maya Angelou gave, who's sort of my patron saint I'm talking about, at HRC in the early 90s. And the other was a speech, Dr. King's mountaintop speech. But I only wanted to hear one little piece of it because it's too long. I mean, not to criticize Dr. King, but it's a very long speech. And but there's this one little brilliant section in there, and he's talking about the road to Jericho and the people and the Levites who didn't stop for the man who had been captured by thieves. Anyway, and he says this thing, he says, the question is not if I stop for them, what will happen to me? The question is if I do not stop for them, what will happen to them?
Right. And
I just needed to hear that because sometimes I get very selfish and want to look out for myself. So anyway.
I got to say, we're sitting here in front of 2,000 or so people who are basically waiting for the headlining act to come on. And
well, we got them for another 25 minutes, so let's make it count.
And I'll admit that has me a little bit rattled, but you seem unfazed, which is how you looked when you were delivering your Harvard Business School speech. Is all of this as easy as you make it look?
No, I mean, I didn't sleep last night, and I woke up and I was on the verge of tears most of the day, so I've been falling apart. But
doesn't show.
What's that?
It doesn't show.
Good. So if there are any filmmakers here, they should I need a job. No, but I think about this. You talk about the morning of that Harvard speech. That speech really changed my life in a lot of ways, and not because of all the stuff that's happened after. It was the first very personal speech that I wrote. I mean, I've been speaking since I was 5 years old in the church, the Easter speech kind of thing. And so I knew how to give a speech, but this was a different thing because I was trying to work through a question for myself. And I woke up the morning of that speech, and everything just fell apart. It was the coldest day in May in the history of Boston. It was raining. I had about 2 or 3 hours of sleep the night before. And my last run-through had been a complete disaster. And so I'm starting to get real nervous, and I go and lock myself into this conference room on campus to try to compose my nerves. And it's not working at all. I'm sort of having these crying spells and just really, as I say, falling apart. And then about 8:30 that morning, somebody called and told me Maya Angelou had died. And Maya was sort of my patron saint. I had never met her before, but she meant a great deal to me. And so I just took this as a terrible omen that, this speech is going to be so bad, Maya didn't even want to be around for it. And so, man, Jeff, I'm just losing it. So about 9 o'clock, I didn't know what else to do, so I called my grandmother, who's right up in Dallas. She was 81 at the time, and I said, Granny, would you pray for me real quick? And my grandmother's a bit of a prayer fascist, if I dropped a bottle of water, she'd pray over it for 2 or 3 days. And so I knew she'd pray, and I thought I knew what she would say, but she prayed this prayer that totally changed my life. She said, God, will you help Casey remove self so that whatever it is you have to say to people, they can receive it? because there are a lot of cultures, but there's only one mankind, and all of them can hear you if he gets out of the way. And it was a bit like stepping out of the matrix, you know. I mean, I had never really understood how much my ego had been in the way of even the most altruistic things that I had done. I had never really understood what it meant to be a vessel. And it totally changed my life, and the things that people have told me about listening to that speech and what it meant to them, or anything that happened afterwards, didn't register to me as, Casey, you're really awesome, right? It registered to me as, Casey, this is not about you, right? And if you just realize that despite your weakness and your frailties and your ego and your fear and all the hot mess stuff you got going on in your life, if you just realize that there's something larger than you that is using you for some reason that you may never know, then you'll be all right. So, you know, I'm playing with house money at this point, you see. So that's the only way I can sit up here without, you know, needing to be rushed to the hospital.
You know, I mean, that answer reminds me that one thing I've seen you talk a lot about in other interviews is the strength you get from being vulnerable, from being open about your fears and your failures and your weaknesses. And, you know, you're 29 years old, but in less than 3 decades, you've inhabited a lot of different worlds. You grew up in a fairly rough part of Dallas. You knew the sanctuary of the black church. You played very high-level athletics. You went to 2 Ivy League universities. You've worked in Washington, D.C. You've worked on Wall Street. You worked on a Texas political campaign. You've hobnobbed with billionaire philanthropists.
I didn't hobnob.
Okay.
I mean, I was...
You hung out. Of all those worlds you've been in, which world is the toughest to be vulnerable in? You know, I've kind of lived America from the very bottom to the very top in a way. And it's quite frightening on both ends. The most honest thing I could say is, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to be vulnerable in any room, at any time. When I think about the people that I grew up with, or myself when I grew up, the great vulnerability is that if you think about for one moment all the stuff that's bothering you, you'll just completely fall apart. And you just don't have time to have a breakdown. You don't have time to admit your weakness. You don't have time to dream, really, or think about the fullness of your human expression. You're just trying to get through the day. The other end of the spectrum, it's interesting how afraid I have been, my friends have been, in very great jobs, in very great schools with so much opportunity. And there's almost this sense of we've got so much to lose that we don't want to risk somebody thinking we're not God's gift to humankind. But I think the common thing is that there is an extraordinary cost to living a fraudulent life. And it's a cost that you might not even realize until it's too late. And when I say fraudulent, I don't mean a crook. I mean living in a way that is not engaging in an exercise of liberation, which is, as I understand it through bell hooks, an understanding of the truth so powerful there's no turning back from it. Vulnerability is really just about being very considering fear and lying as the enemy, I think, and I think people on both ends of the spectrum need to do that. All right, I got one more question, then I think we're going to open up the floor to questions. The president is here today. He's going to be talking about a lot of these very issues you've been thinking about: technology, social justice, political change, and the intersection of all those things. If you had a few minutes with him and could say something to him about all this, what would you say?
You know, not that he'd care, but I'd probably say the same thing to him that I say to everybody, that I say to myself every day. I'd ask him, well, Mr. President, what would you say if you were not afraid? I'm not sure that he would necessarily say what he's coming here to say, as far as I understand it, which is, in essence, to sort of, give a gold stamp of approval to the tech and business oligarchs of our time and ask them to save the country. We in this room, at places like South by Southwest, conferences like this, we represent a gospel that says that markets and technology will save us. And we have a willingness to pursue that, sometimes at all costs, including the cost of millions of people who are being left behind in this country. I think about, Detroit, where we work quite a bit. 700,000 people, 82% black, 65% below the poverty line. In a major American city. I'm not sure that the biggest solution there is to get more coders. I think about the work that we do in Appalachia, a town in Kentucky, where 1,000 coal miners have lost their job in the past year. I'm not sure just teaching those people how to code is going to heal that wound. I think about the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans, where we had an entrepreneur who opened the first grocery store in the lower Ninth Ward after 10 years after Hurricane Katrina. I mean, 7,000 people in a major American city having to go an hour and a half, 3 buses just to get bread and milk. That is unconscionable. That's not a technological problem. And so I think what he'd say if he weren't afraid, he'd point out, how can we put a robot on Mars, but we can't get an 8-year-old girl some food? How can we lay fiber optic cables under the ocean, but we can't lay water pipes in Flint? How can we design technology that can help us hear black holes, but we can't hear our brothers and our sisters in our own neighborhoods? I mean, this is a deeply... This is a deeply troubling reality in this country. And I know this president cares deeply about these issues. And I know he's got extraordinary gifts and extraordinary constraints. He inspired me and a whole lot of folks in my generation to think that we could actually do something that mattered. And we really do love him for that. And I think that his job is to push us, not to pat us on the back, to push us to think about the questions we have to ask, the commitments we have to make, the sacrifices that we have to consider. And there will be sacrifices if we're going to answer these questions. If we're going to make the idea and the promise of the country real. And so, I hope, I pray, I plead that he does this on this stage. I hope he dedicates himself to that in his post-presidency also. I think he can be part of this awakening that we're talking about as an ex-president in a way that perhaps he might have been constrained as a sitting president.
Okay.
But I don't think he needs my advice at all.
Ready to open it up to the floor? All right. How are we doing here?
We're here and here. We can open up for a few questions down in this lower section.
Got one over here.
Thank you very much. That was a really inspiring speech, and thank you for giving the speech. My question is, and this also ties into the question about the political state of this country, having traveled around the country a lot and met a lot of people in a lot of different places, did you find some people who felt that things sort of used to be better And if that is the case, what would the implications both for business and political leaders, or what would your thoughts be on what the implications would be for business and political leaders going forward if people think things sort of used to be better?
I'm just 30 years old. I don't know how things used to be, really. 29, actually. I've got a little time. You know, I think about my grandmother's grandfather was born a slave here in Texas. My parents went to segregated schools. They moved into neighborhoods. They were egged when they moved in the neighborhood that I grew up in. I have a hard time believing that things used to be better. You see? But I think what you're getting at, and again, I'm not getting into the politics of this because I'm not a political expert, but I think what you're getting at is that there is a deep sense of loss in certain segments of the population in places that we've worked in, Appalachia, et cetera, where if you put yourself, what is the Atticus Finch thing, if you got in a man's shoes and mushed around a little bit, you might say, I see how you could feel that you have lost something, that you want to get your country back. And the only implication that I know is the implication that we tell our fellows all the time. You're not going to help anybody if you think you're there to save them, if you think you're there because you know more than they do, if you can't listen to them, if you can't try to put yourself in those shoes and say, why do you feel like this? And to say that I hear you. Right? Most humans really just want to know that they are heard and that they matter in some way. And so the worst thing we could do, regardless of what the political answer is, the human thing that we can do is to try to understand why people feel so hurt and so besieged. And then we might have a sense of what to do.
Okay, I have a question over here on this side.
Hi, Casey. My name is Rosie Von Leela. Thank you very much for your vulnerability on stage. It's very clear that you are getting out of the way for something bigger to speak through you. And I'm curious if you can share a little bit about your personal practices or your personal rituals that help you create that space, because we all have that potential, but we have to create the practices around it. So I'm curious what you do.
Yeah, oh man. I'm glad I'm in Texas for that question, because if I were, somewhere else, people might think I'm kind of crazy. I have had, I think today, somewhere in the realm of half a dozen people praying for me that I have talked to directly. Those people have activated probably, hopefully, I'm prayerful that they've activated some hundreds of other people to pray. And not to pray that I do a good job, but right before I come on, and Todd might say this, I say the same thing my grandmother said. Will you help me get out of the way so that whatever it is you have to say, people can receive it, because there are a lot of cultures, but there's only one mankind, and all of them can hear you if I get out of the way. It's really just like blocking and tackling, And you don't have to believe in a Christian God or a God at all to have some sense of, I am here to be used for something, and some very rudimentary words to ask that something to do its thing instead of you. And then I think you do the work. I ask this question again every day. What would I do? What would I say if I were not afraid? I can't tell you how fearful I am. I was talking to somebody this morning, and I said, I can't, this last question might be about the president. I can't say anything that seems harsh, or anything like that. But the truth is that I have no personal vendetta against anybody. I'm just trying to find the truth in some way. And the thing that we are most fearful of, I mean capital F, fear, thing I am most fearful of, often is the exact thing that I'm supposed to do. And so by asking this question, what would I do or what would I say if I weren't afraid, it almost turns on the lights in this closet, and it gets all the bugaboos out, And it says, I see you now, and I'm going to kick your butt, that kind of thing. So those are two things that I do on an almost daily basis. And the people around me matter so much. And I don't really care how smart they are. Hopefully they're smart. But if they have no sense of discernment, if they have no connection to something larger than themselves, I just can't be very close to them. And as simple as that.
And I believe that is all the time we have.
Awesome. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Good job.